I'm going to start out with just one slide about Eagle, and then I'm going to do my favorite new slide I've been doing lately, what I call affectionately stealing the vendor's thunder. I'm going to try my best to say everything great about Cynet that TJ is going to say right after me. You're welcome, TJ. Um, then we're going to go into an overview of Cynet. As many of you might remember, we did a webinar on Cynet a few months ago. We kind of did it backwards because that was really an in-depth GUI demonstration. So TJ is going to step back, talk about Cynet at a high level, and then we're going to do what I think are the cooler nerd bits today. We're going to talk about the 2023 Mitre evaluations, Turla edition. So we're not only going to talk about what they are and how you get value out of them. TJ's even going to show you how to compare Cynet against maybe your incumbent or someone else you're looking at. We're going to talk a lot about how well Cynet performed there as well. All right, so let's get right into it. So the way Eagle likes to work when we perform due diligence is really what we're trying to outline here on this slide. As you probably heard me say before, everybody in the industry likes to talk about defense in depth. It is important. At Eagle, we also like to talk about recovery in depth. It's the notion that you may need multiple backups for different purposes, quick restores, geographic separation, immutability. And of course, nowadays, all of that necessitates what we at Eagle like to call design in depth. It's the notion that you can't design in a silo. And as I've been fond of saying lately, every solution you choose and even every setting that you change in an application is an opportunity to improve your security posture and your recoverability. So we like to follow those 5 rules down there in the bottom right when we perform due diligence. Security first on everything. That's timely with what we're talking about today. Recoverability to each layer, simplicity, right? You guys don't have a lot of time to manage these products. You're managing a lot of other products. They should be turnkey. They should work right out of the box. We'll talk more about Cynet in that aspect today. Quality support, and then the notion that business outcomes matter. You probably don't need a stripped down Porsche or a loaded Ferrari. You need something that recognizes what you're trying to accomplish. So that's a nice segue into my favorite slide where I'm trying to steal TJ's thunder. So as you guys well know, we don't go out and carry a lot of products. We're not an a la carte VAR. We think it's our responsibility to actually provide the due diligence to go out there and find what's the best in the industry and what solves a particular problem. So as that relates to Cynet, roughly 4 years ago, we set out to find what we thought was the best EDR/MDR in the SMB space. And as you guys are well aware, medium-sized businesses can get pretty large, but they do have unique constraints. You guys probably don't have a fully staffed security operations center. You need something that's full featured, right? That one and done approach that gives you all the acronyms and capabilities that you require. We also recognize that in that space, you need outstanding support. You not only need accessible cybersecurity experts, but they need to hop in and get engaged immediately when they or you see something of concern. And oddly, we put a lot of weight on resource utilization. I've seen way too many customers deploy an EDR and then have to do a desktop update or, basically refresh 300 laptops because their machines are getting pummeled with resource issues. So we actually narrowed it down to 7 products, and we had our pen testers bang on them for 2 weeks. And that was when for Eagle that Cynet really rose to the top. We immediately noticed that it had the smallest resource utilization of any of the products. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that these guys built this all in-house. There's no integration, right? They focus on innovation. But what really impressed us was how effective the product was. We threw 100 different red team assessments at these EDRs, and Cynet captured 100% of the indicators of compromise. There were some others that did fairly well. I think our lowest score, for instance, was 17% in comparison, right? But we felt like what we had found is a product that was very effective, that had that full integrated platform, right? That had really good support, put the M in MDR, as I like to say. And something that TJ is going to talk more about is, validation is always really nice too. So this year we got to see how Cynet performed in the 2023 Mitre evaluations, and TJ is going to show you it was very impressive. So that tagline you see down there for today's webinar, Small Business Fortified, I got to admit, it does seem really applicable. So with that, TJ, I think I'm ready to hand it over to you so you can kind of take a step back and talk about Cynet in general.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brian, for the introduction and for stealing my thunder. Now on the upside, I'm going to actually flesh out some of that thunder a little bit. So while you may have made the noise, I'm going to show a little bit of the other stuff. Right.
I love it.
So hopefully you'll see my screen here in just a half a second or so as it decides to
Yep.
present. There
It's
we
up.
go. Okay, so for those of you who haven't ever encountered Cynet before, or may have seen the presentation a month ago and kind of gotten into the real deep weeds, what I wanted to do is take a step back, as Brian said, and kind of talk about what it is exactly that Cynet provides. And what we do provide is an automated XDR platform. Now, what is XDR, right? Obviously, we know what automated means: hands off, automatic, things doing things on its own without you having to get involved. But the XDR aspect, what is it? Well, it stands for extended detection and response. Well, what does that fundamentally mean? Well, the extended comes from the fact that about 20 years ago, you had strictly from a security standpoint, endpoint security and network security being independent things. And the endpoint security was pretty much, for the most part, dealing strictly with malware. So looking for things like your old school viruses like Nimda, Goner, Bagel, SOCAN, etc. That then kind of transitioned into doing endpoint detection and response. So looking at other characteristics that happened on the endpoint. So going beyond the wide net attack vectors of a virus that was simply just mass disseminated across the rest of the world, and hoping to see if maybe they catch a couple of fish here, or looking to wreak as much havoc as possible across a wide swath of places, usually for a bit of notoriety, in some cases out of malicious intent. Attackers started realizing that they could actually generate revenue out of this. And that's where we started seeing things like malware showing up, right? Viruses obviously were things that infected already existing objects or pretended to be something that they weren't as a basic Trojan. But malware was a much more broad actual application, and really kind of the first iteration of that was fake antivirus. I'm dating myself here. Obviously, I've talked about a bunch of things that are ancient history in terms of computer security, but I'm sure that there are definitely some people on the call that remember fake AV popping up for the first time. End users getting a pop-up message saying that your system is infected, contact this number, install this application that will resolve the problem. And that really diverged from that small individual and virus type of object, right? That tended to be fairly small, infected already existing things and kind of self-replicated. With the fake antivirus, it moved us into that malware world where there was much more going on. There was a user interface, there were buttons, there were things that were happening that the user could see, and obviously pretended to be malware protection software. That then kind of continued to morph even further. And in order to address those things, you could no longer simply just look at an individual file and say, oh, this is a virus. You got to look at other activity that was going on, how the threat interacted with the registry, how it interacted with processes, how it interacted with the user. And so now we moved into that EDR space. Well, what is XDR? Well, it's extending that even further and now looking at not just how it interacted with the user, but how the user interacts with the endpoint. What's normal for user activity? Do they typically open these applications? Do they typically access these resources? What about the network perspective? Do they normally go to these sites? Do they normally access these resources internally? So communicating from one host to a server, one host to another host, as we would call lateral movement. So no longer simply just looking at what was inside the network and going out and coming in from the outside down to the individual client. Now we have to be concerned about moving from one system to another inside the same organization. And so attackers are now utilizing that lateral movement. They would gain access to one system by using some of those EDR type of tactics, right? Convincing an end user that this is a good set to open, or following a phishing attack, which would then create this backdoor into their system. Once the attacker's now on that system, they're going to do more of that EDR function, right? They're going to try to elevate privileges. They're going to try to access other resources on that host, but then they're going to try to move off of that host. They're going to try to move laterally inside the same network. So now that I've gotten access to TJ's laptop, maybe I can get access to Brian's system. Maybe I can get access to Anthony's server. So we're going to try to expand from there. In order for me to do that, I need to take advantage of network functionality. And that then presents a problem for an EDR because it's only looking at the endpoint stuff. So Now we have XDR, that ability to look at it laterally. So what is Cynet 360 Auto XDR? It's our ability to have all visibility across all of those vectors. Now, in terms of what we do for that particular protection, well, as I mentioned already, we look at our endpoint. Let me grab my laser pointer so I'm not simply just kind of waving a mouse in people's faces here. So there we go, a nice little laser pointer. So we obviously talk about the endpoint, right? We do that next-gen AV functionality. So if a file shows up, dropped on the disk, yep, we know it's a virus. Of course, for that, we use the 3 mechanisms, signature-based. Yes, despite what the marketing world may tell you, signatures are still important. Why? Because the other 2 mechanisms, machine learning and artificial intelligence, take time to train. And if you have a brand new your AI and ML deal with it if it hasn't been trained in it, right? So that takes time. And in order to be able to train an AI or an ML system that is very effective at identifying zero-day threats, it's not 100%. Nothing fundamentally is. So if that's the case, how long is that window of vulnerability open to you? Well, it only takes a couple of minutes in order for a security vendor to create a signature. So we'll deliver those in order to bridge that gap between the AI and ML engine not having the ability to detect that 0-day and be able to respond to it quickly. So Cynet does provide all 3. We also do that user activity monitoring. So getting to understand what is common for a user. Are they normally accessing resources during the weekday? Do they not typically log in at night? Be able to generate rules that define what is or isn't acceptable. Then there's that network piece, that lateral movement functionality. There's our cloud and SaaS application monitoring. So making sure that those cloud platforms that you use are configured securely, because it is a shared security model, right? The vendor that you're purchasing from is responsible for the physical security of the environment, as well as maintaining it from vulnerabilities and keeping the software up to date. But you're responsible for controlling who has access to it, ensuring that it doesn't open access to unauthorized or unwanted individuals. So with our SaaS and CSPM monitoring, we're looking to make sure that those configuration settings are secure. And then lastly, ingesting third-party information, because having more information about your environment, about the activity going on, can only make us better and have a better understanding of the context of what is going on. Now, all of that functionality is tied together in that Cynet 360 Auto XDR. So we're going to provide that protection using across all of those mechanisms that I mentioned earlier. We're going to take that information and correlate it so that we know what element is attached to what other element, and we'll see that in a few minutes, and then respond to it automatically. So breaking that all out into individual objects, you can see we have this pinwheel, and it's broken out into 3 primary. Our protection side, right? So
Yes,
the XDR aspect of it, right? That's that protection piece. So that next-gen AV, the endpoint detection and response functionality, user behavior, network detection rules. So looking again for that lateral movement, looking for different tactics like ICMP tunneling. So utilizing the allowed protocols to do things that they normally shouldn't do, right? Deception, presenting more fake information to the attacker that they're more likely to expose themselves as being present inside the environment. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I already mentioned the SaaS and the CLM, or centralized log management. Now, we mentioned the automation. When something happens on one individual client, we know that there's a high probability of that same thing happening on another system. So that being the case, if it triggers on machine X, we want to go look to see if it exists anywhere else. And we want that to happen without that added workload put on the administrator and the security staff for the organization, right? We already know the data that's out there. Let's go hunting for it. Then once we find it, let's automatically remediate it according to the organization's desired process. All endpoint security products, whether it's an EDR, an XDR, an antivirus product, they all have automated responses. But those are what I call the direct action response. This is a bad process. So what's the direct action in that case? Let's kill the bad process. This is a bad file. What is the direct action for the file? Well, quarantine it, delete it, rename it. One of those 3. This is a bad network connection. So what do? We drop the network traffic. Okay, that's great. into a more secure state. I'm no longer at risk from the particular threat. But what about those other things that you normally do as part of your response mechanism? Some organizations require the device to be isolated until physically reviewed by a security staff personnel. Other organizations require things like forensic images to be taken, forensic snapshots. Other systems and other organizations may require the device to simply just be rolled back to the previous image. So if you're using VDI or ESX or Hyper-V, you want the system to get rolled back to its previously known good state. That's great, but why do that manually? Have the system do it for you. Now, every organization's a little bit different when it comes to those things. So obviously there's going to be a little bit of work that will be done to determine what it exactly is that you want to do and then put it into place. And we assist and Eagle assist in that process, right? Then you can create those custom playbooks, right? So that automation, is there a situation where it's, okay, well, if it's X, then do A and B things. If it's Y, then do A, C, and D things. Those types of decision-making processes sometimes come into play. And so with our custom playbooks, you have the ability to make those workflows that fit your environment so that you can have as much automation as fits. And then the incident engine breaks it all down to make it very easy to understand, even for people who are not entirely immersed in that security space, in that security world, so they can follow along exactly what happened. And then lastly, is behind all of this is our 24/7 managed detection and response service. Behind the entire technology are security analysts that have extensive experience in investigating and responding to threats. So we're going to not only monitor your environment in terms of an alert came in, we act as a 24/7 notification source, like an alarm system. Something happens at 2 o'clock in the morning, we pick up the phone, give you a call. We also will reach out and assist you in that process so that if you need some assistance, how do I best respond to it? How do I take that particular action? Let me decide what needs to be done, and then Cynet will help you do it. We'll also do threat hunting and remote incident response. So when that event occurs, we will proactively go hunting with you and assist you on that incident response. So we'll give you a full breakdown of everything that happened and be able to provide that remotely without having to go on site. And then lastly, attack reports, which basically break down that incident response and that attack in a simple and easy to understand report that you can follow along.
Hey, TJ, I've got a question, but
Yes.
I just wanted to reiterate one of my favorite things about Cynet, and you kind of touched on it, is that we have a lot of customers that just deploy it and they don't really mess with it that much, right? And it works really well in that use case. But what I also see is that folks start to get more interested in cybersecurity, their skills get a little sharpened, and you guys are really good in that area too, because as you said, they can go down the rabbit hole, they can start to do threat hunting, they can create some of those SOAR, those automation capabilities. So I think you guys do a really good job of riding that line between works out of the box and being able to add a lot more sophistication, right?
Yeah.
And with that, I also had a question. Brad wanted to know if Cynet uses any AI or machine learning techniques, and if so, could you elaborate how or where?
Yeah, absolutely. So we use AI and ML in multiple places. As I mentioned originally, talking about that next gen AV functionality. The AI and ML is used there for identifying threats at a file level. So brand new file shows up on the system, let's scan it. And we'll use the AI and ML engine to be able to provide as much zero-day protection as possible. But as I mentioned, there's only so much that AI and ML can do, right? It has what's called a confidence level. And it may see something a little unusual, but may not have broken that confidence level in order to say that this is a definitive threat. So it's kind of up in the air. And that's where the signatures come into play. So they're still used in that particular context. The AI and ML is also used in a post-execution mechanism. So when a process goes through that initial allocation of resources, somebody clicked on the file, it goes to launch, the operating system says, oh, Cynet's going to scan it, says it looks okay, don't have anything in it that we know that's definitively bad, let's let it run. Or it's possible that it's been obfuscated in such a way that scanning prior to execution would result in no data of saying that it's good or bad. There's just too much scrambled bits in there to really make a definitive picture out of it. So it launches. With it launching, we will then monitor it and see what it does. And there is artificial intelligence and machine learning that is used part of that mechanism to be able to identify whether or not it is doing tactics or techniques that we know are definitively bad. So things like a process hollowing or process impersonation, ways for an attacker to convince the OS that this process is okay because I'm pretending to be a legitimate process, or I'm taking a legitimate process and emptying out the guts and replacing it with mine. So from the outside, it still looks like a legitimate thing, but on the inside, it's nothing but hate and discontent, right? So we use AI and ML in that sense. And then lastly, we use AI and ML as part of our analysis function. So all of that data that goes into the platform, not only does it show up in your console, it's also available for our analysts to be proactive in hunting threats. And so we use AI and ML in order to analyze that information. Now, in that case, we're not fully looking for threats definitively. We're using AI and ML to basically raise alerts of questionable nature to say, you know what, this is on that border. Let's have a security analyst, Cynet, PsyOps, review that information to be able to define, yep, that is a definitive attack. Let's respond to it accordingly. Let's reach out to the customer and assist them along the way. So AI and ML at a pre-execution level, standard next-gen AV type of stuff. Post-execution level, more of an EDR type of functionality. And then also from an analytical level for those things that kind of quote unquote will slip through the gaps of an EDR or an endpoint product.
That's got to be the best
Awesome.
live answer I've ever heard, TJ. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. All right. So now, how do we know that Cynet's good at what we talk about, right? And you're going to see a number of vendors talking about the Mitre attack framework. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Mitre, they are a non-governmental but government-funded think tank. And one of the things that they do is investigate cybersecurity and how best to protect the U.S. Nation in terms of cybersecurity. And they also want to promulgate that information for all of U.S. corporations so that they can take advantage of that knowledge, right, and be able to put it into place. And so they've taken that and broken it down into what they call the attack framework. Now, attack is actually an acronym, right? So it stands for adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. The terminology basically breaks things down into what are known as TTPs, tactics, techniques, and processes. So every type of attack that occurs, whether it is viral or active adversary or network-based or endpoint-based, are going to utilize some form of a TTP, right? And that's the idea of the framework, is to basically say, these are the ways that an attacker can try to take advantage of an environment in order to infiltrate it, be able to cause harm, be able to steal data, etc. Now, they'll break it down so that you can make it understandable, right? So things like a command and scripting interpreter PowerShell, what is that? They give a nice little description of it. They then show examples of that particular procedure being utilized by those attack organizations, right? Those threat actors. And so they give you examples of which threats that it's been used in. It now has become the standard for how the security community talks about it. So we now have a common framework that everybody can have a discussion around a threat event and really be singing from the same song sheet, right? Years ago, every vendor kind of talked about how they did things in their own little special secret sauce, which is still the case, right? Every vendor does things a little bit differently. But from a consumer perspective, it was very hard to understand what was what. Does your system protect against this particular attack? Oh, well, we kind of do it this way. And then another vendor talks about doing another way. Well, are they even talking about the same tactic? Are they talking about the same technique? So by having it kind of becoming the de facto standard, it makes life a lot easier for everyone involved. Now, that attack evaluation is Mitre saying we've got this framework. Let's see how other vendors, how all the vendors in the space do in order to protect against real world threats. So for the past 5 years, they have been taking actual threat events and then replaying them against all those vendors who participate. Now, 5 years ago, they were just kind of getting started, so there were only about 12 or 13 vendors that were involved. Then the next year it grew some more, and then the next year it grew some more, to the point that there are now roughly 30 vendors. Now, there are more than 30 vendors in this space, so not everybody is in it. But with the testing becoming so standardized and well-defined, having a vendor that's not actually getting tested is a little bit of an indication that they may not actually be as effective, right? In a certain sense, you could say they're a little afraid of what their results might be. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, when that attack evaluation occurs, they're going to run these threats against the product, and they're going to run it over several days. There will be 2 attack models that they use. Then that'll be on day 1 will be attack model 1 or attack scenario 1. Day 2 will be attack scenario 2. And then day 3 is the opportunity for them to complete whatever didn't finish throughout the day, because sometimes they get sidetracked, sometimes there's a network issue, whatever it is, to kind of extend that process. So they have the option to be able to kind of finish testing if it wasn't all done completed, as well as the ability for the vendor to maybe be able to make adjustments in order to be able to improve their scores. Right, to be able to say, oh, we ran it with this one configuration. If we turn this other configuration on, we can obviously see that we've done better, right? Now, those events, when they run the scenarios, they're going to look to see what information is identified those first 2 and then 3rd day. And they're going to break those detections out into results. The first result is going to be a technique. The vendor knows exactly what was done and mapped it to a specific technique within the framework. So this was a command and control sequence. This maps to the particular technique 1107 dot whatever, and they have full visibility into it. The next level will be a tactic. So they know why it was done. So what was the purpose of doing this thing that we know is bad? It was in order to gain remote access. It was in order to exfiltrate information. It was part of reconnaissance. So they know that it was part of a given tactic, but not the specific technique that was used, right? So keep in mind that tactics are overarching ideas and tactics are the specific implementation of the overall tactic, right? Then this will be the end of full visibility and detection. General means that you know that something bad happens, but you didn't necessarily identify that it was a particular tactic, right? So maybe you saw that this process was doing something that was inappropriate, and so you would respond to it and kill that particular process, or delete the file, or drop the network traffic, etc. You know it's definitively bad, but you just haven't mapped it to one of those tactics or the techniques. So you can't necessarily say why it was done or what was exactly done, but you know that it was definitely bad, right? So actual malicious abnormal of information was identified. Then lastly, there's telemetry. You saw stuff going on, but you didn't know it was good or bad. This process launched, that file was deleted, that user logged in, this network connection was open, that's it. But that doesn't make a determination on whether it's dangerous or not. So that's where the telemetry comes into play. And then last, which is where you don't want to be, is none. You didn't see any of it. Now, one can argue that telemetry is as bad as none. However, I wouldn't quite go that far, because while you have telemetry, you can at least look back through the information and be able to make decisions based on it. If you have no information, you've got nowhere to go. It didn't exist, it never happened, right? Then lastly, I've said lastly twice, I recognize that, but not applicable simply just means that this particular thing doesn't apply to the scenario that we're working on. Some vendors don't have a Unix or Linux product, therefore those particular tactics and techniques never run because it doesn't apply. They don't have those platforms to be able to protect. Okay, so keep this in mind And what we're going to do now is we're going to switch over to the Mitre website, and we're going to talk about how you can use this for yourself and take advantage of it. As I mentioned, Mitre's been doing this for about 5 years. And over the years, they have been improving the ability for IT administrators, security analysts, CISOs to be able to take advantage of this information. And I think they've done a really good job in the current setup. Now, when you go to the Attack Evaluations website, you can look at the results. From here, you can drill into the previous ones. APT3 was the first one, then APT29, Carbanic and Fin7, then Wizard Spider and Sandworm, and then most recently Turla. And if you select them from the dropdown, they will give you the explanation of what they are, right? So what is Turla? They'll also talk about the different scenarios that they'll run. So Carbon versus the snake process, right? And then you can see the protections. How did the product actually respond to it? So for now, right? And so you can see that it follows a multi-phase approach specifically for Carbon, and we can select our participants. Okay, so like I said, you can go to the Mitre website, attackevals.mitre-engenuity.org, and then go to the results section. From there, you can then hit the drop down and select the particular year you want to review. And it basically, they don't put the year in the drop down, but just know that the one at the top is the most current year, the one at the bottom is every year behind that. So 2023, 2021, 2020, 2023, 22, 21, 2019. There we go. I can count backwards. At least I think I can. Okay. So then you can pick the particular scenario, and they use 2 scenarios. In this case, this year it's Carbon and the snake scenario. You can also look at the results for protections. So they run the scenarios again, and did you actually stop it? Because being able to see it isn't necessarily the end of the whole conversation. Then you can select your participants up to 3. So we'll just go ahead and we'll grab these 3 here. We'll grab CrowdStrike, Broadcom, and Cynet, right? Those are pretty common. And like I said, you can go through the whole process and selecting your pair. I always recommend pick the one that you're currently using, compare it to Cynet, and then throw in a third, right? And then maybe continue to shuffle through. Now, the layout is fairly understandable, but there are 2 things that I want to point out. First, in the right hand, we have that detection key. Remember the technique, tactic, general, telemetry, none, and not applicable. That's that basically run down here. You can expand this out and it will show you right at the bottom of the page. The dark purple is a technique, lighter purple, tactic, red is general, orange telemetry, none is yellow, not applicable is gray. So you can see from here, it looks like CrowdStrike and Cynet did very well, and you can see that Broadcom struggled a little bit. However, there are 2 other check marks to be aware of. On the left-hand side, you have modifiers. Configuration change. That 3rd day that I was talking about, when they do testing on day 1 for scenario 1, testing on day 2 for scenario 2, day 3 is where they can do a retest, and they can make adjustments to be able to kind of move up the scale. So if we uncheck configuration change, we now see what it looks like on the initial run. And if you hover over, you can see the total count. The total number of techniques that were used in this Carbon scenario was 76 techniques. CrowdStrike was able to identify 72 of them. In this case, Cynet was able to identify 70 from a technique perspective. But you'll notice that we do have general information and tactic information. We don't have a telemetry only. So we know that there was a threat all the way across the board without making any adjustments. Now, the adjustments that we did make, we'll be able to map it correctly. So if you had a general, show that it was actually a tactic or a technique to map to. CrowdStrike, same thing. However, unfortunately for Symantec, they missed 17 entirely, not even telemetry information. Now, if we scroll down a little bit, we can see that color coding, we can see that on the initial connection here in the case of CrowdStrike, they missed 1 and only had telemetry only. So they weren't able to identify that it was actually bad. But we did have a couple of generals, right? Like I mentioned, we do know that it was bad. We just simply didn't map it. So this is how you can read it. The other checkbox is delayed. Delayed means that the event occurred, and then sometime after, hours, if not days later, the system was able to say, oh, I saw that happen. I now understand that this is a bad thing. So they're basically going back and rerunning their AI and ML engine across the data that already came in. The problem with that mechanism is, yes, you do eventually find it, but the entire time from when it actually occurred to the time that it's identified and responded to is your window of vulnerability. That window needs to be as short as possible. With Cynet, because we provide real-time protection, that vulnerability window is measured in milliseconds or seconds, not even minutes. In the case of CrowdStrike and Broadcom, unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. You can see that when we move out of the real-time information, or I should say move out of delayed information and look at real time, you can see that CrowdStrike has gotten slightly worse, as did Broadcom, but you can see that Cynet remained the same, right? So that's how you can use the MITRE attack framework to be able to do your own analysis. Again, very easy to use. Just keep in mind that configuration change and that delay, what those mean is configuration change, they may have moved up the ladder a little bit. Maybe they had telemetry only and then were able to identify it as actually dangerous. So they made an adjustment in order to do that. Or they moved up the ladder a little bit to say, well, we already knew it was bad. Let's try and put a number on it. Let's tie it to a specific tactic or technique. The first one, big concern. If all they had was telemetry, then they weren't able to provide any visibility that this was something bad, which means that they had no ability to respond to it. If you're moving up the ladder from general to tactic or technique, yep, makes life a little bit better, a little bit easier from an understanding perspective, but it still provides you the actual protection, the ability to put it down. Delayed is that window. How much time frame do I have between the threat actually occurring inside my environment and somebody recognizing it, or in this case, technologically recognizing it and responding to it? Is it going to be running rampant for the next hour, 2 hours, or 3 days? Or is it going to get started, identified as bad, shut down within a matter of milliseconds, or maybe even just actual seconds, 20, 30 seconds kind of thing, right? So that's how you can take advantage of that. Now, let's jump back into our presentation real quick. Our false positive rate is very low to begin with. Now, one thing that MITRE doesn't actually show you in their information is that it doesn't actually track false positive rates. So you can't really use it for that. What you can do, however, is extrapolate information from it in terms of what other third-party testing shows, right? So organizations like VirusTotal will track stuff, be able to see whether or not something was identified or not, and then be able to extrapolate it across other systems. Your AV comparatives, avtest.org, et cetera, they all kind of have that false positive rate. Now, what you find is when you look at all the information for an XDR platform, the false positive rate tends to be in the 15 to 20% range as an average. There are some vendors out there that are north of 30%, and there are some vendors out there that are in the single digits. What that means is that for every X number of alerts that come into the console, that percentage of false positive rate will be the ones that you have to wade through to see are actually legitimate or not. So if you're north of 30%, you get 100 alerts in the console, 30 odd alerts will actually be false alerts that you then have to triage and deal with. If it's in the 15, 20 is the overall average, then you get 15 to 20. For Cynet, our false positive rate is below 1%. On average, we'll have a false positive in the general 160 to 170 alert range. So just a little north of a half a percentage point. So an order of magnitude better than the industry at large. Now, that kind of begs the question, why are we so good at it? The reason for that is because all of that information goes into our PsyOps team, right? Recall that they are an incident response and a threat hunting organization. All that data they have visibility into and creates a feedback loop into our R&D team to be able to make adjustments. So when they know that we've been a little overly aggressive on something, we have the ability to make that adjustment and tuning. Right. So every customer gets to take advantage of our PsyOps team, which means that we also get to take advantage of all of our customers and the data that they're feeding into us. So we're able to take advantage of that massive amount of information and be able to say, oh, you know what? When we produced this particular AI or ML trigger, we were a little aggressive on it. Back it off, reduce that false positive rate, right? And conversely, we can also improve it going up, right? We had something that we know is definitively bad from our analysts looking at it, and we can say, well, the AI and ML didn't trigger quite right there. Is putting as marginal. Let's make the adjustment and moving it up. Now, in terms of the user behavior stuff, those are rules that you're basically defining. Is this normal behavior or not? So the false positive rate there is really kind of almost non-existent from the standpoint that it is a rule. So if you're defining that this particular user is going to log in Monday through Friday and they now log in on Saturday, well, it's going to be a trigger. It's going to tell you that, yes, they logged in on Saturday. However, is that a false positive? Now, I wouldn't go that far, right? It's something of interest, maybe something of concern, right? But the way the platform works is that it'll prompt the user, hey, was this actually you? And they'll get a message on their phone out of band from the actual interaction that's going on with the login process. So if they're logging into SAP for the first time and that end user never uses SAP, and they get an alert on their phone saying, hey, did you just log into SAP? They can say no, and that will then trigger the alert in the management console to tell you that, hey, somebody is using TJ's credentials to log into a resource that TJ isn't actually using at this point in time. Same thing for, logging in out of normal hours, right? I may have been gone for 2 weeks on vacation, come back, decide, let me do a little catch up. Let me get ahead of the curve and kind of get brought back up to speed on a Saturday. I don't want to be in on Monday with my head spinning, trying to figure out what's been going on for the last 2 weeks. Let me take a little bit of time on Saturday to do it. So I log in on Saturday, get a notice on my phone. Hey, did you log in on Saturday? Yep, that's me. No alert, life goes on. So from that perspective, there's not really going to be a ton in terms of false positives because it's not really a false positive. Somebody did log in with those creds into that particular resource. The question is what was the purpose? And again, purpose is not something that we can obviously test, so to speak. Fatigue is a real thing, so much so that some of the highest profile attacks that have occurred over the last 10 years were because of alert fatigue. If you look at Home Depot, if you look at Target, if you look at Anthem Health, when you look back at the incident response of what actually occurred, it was months from the first set of alerts that came in that were ignored because of the fatigue.
Once again, they've got it all capped for a reason. The fact that there are no configuration changes needed really goes back to that point we made earlier, where this is a great opportunity for SMB, right? To get that full stack integrated coverage works on day one. I don't think I would want to find out later that I didn't block an attack because I hadn't checked a box. Once again, if you have an existing product, you probably should be able to spot them on there, but I would really invite you to go to that Mitre evaluation site. We can send out the link so you could just directly compare the two products and see if what you see compels you, right, to have more conversations around Cynet